All right, we're back. Welcome to Harlem Stories. I'm Adam Feinberg, and
I'm Mark Becker.
Awesome. And we're here today. We're going to talk about HDFC income restricted co-ops. Yeah.
Fun.
So we get a lot of inquiries about these, and even people that don't fall within the income restrictions will call us about them. They're all excited. They see the low price. They hadn't read the details, so they're just like all excited. Like, it's possible to get a 4-bedroom, 1.5 bath apartment for like $500,000-$600,000, and they're like all excited, but they don't realize what it all entails. So
it's kind of like when people call about that building on 65th Street and they don't realize it's a 2-week timeshare.
yeah, or those on the land leases on 57th Street or or 63rd, and there's certain buildings as real estate agents that we wind up hearing our clients get all excited about, but they hadn't really paid a lot of attention to. So HDFCs kind of fall into that category, and I hear a lot of comments on HDFCs, on what they are, what they aren't. They can be misleadingly simple. A lot of people think that these kind of deals are very simple, when in fact the vast majority of them are not. And I've heard from some brokers and some bankers, I'm like, oh yeah, HDFCs are simple. That has not been my experience, nor has it been the experience of all the agents that I've advised, in these HDFCs. So you're probably wondering what these things are. Wouldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. Anytime you see something that looks too good to be true, you want to know, what's the asterisk?
Yeah, in this case, it's quite significant. So to understand what these income-restricted HDFC co-ops are, let me explain a little bit about the background, what this all stands for and what it represents, and some of the aspects of the market for it, how these things are handled from a broker's perspective, and all sorts of topics. We're going to move through this really quickly, but there's a lot more that we probably won't cover that will probably apply to each specific situation. But today we want to give you an overview. Now, to start off with, I've seen HDFCs below $100,000 for a tiny 1-bedroom to I've seen them over $2 million. And, there's stark differences, obviously, in these properties and each one of them. But to understand what an HDFC is, you have to understand the way New York City has evolved over the years and how these were created in the first place. The vast majority of HDFCs out there, they're the pre-war buildings. They were originally built to be market rate. Some, in fact, were originally constructed to be luxury buildings, and they were constructed by architecture firms that we considered the pre-war equivalent to architects. So you might actually see a Schwartz and Gross building, which they tended to build like these large luxury buildings you'll see all over the Upper West Side. But a lot of them are tenements, and ultimately this comes back, and let's go back in time to let's say the 1970s or so, late 60s, early 70s, into the 80s and 90s, and that starts beginning to set the tone for what HDFCs are and how they've evolved and came about. So originally, as the city went through some really tough times over the years, people were abandoning the city left and right. Ultimately, rents were going down. And what wound up happening was landlords were making the determination with rising taxes and declining rents and declining population. Ultimately, what they were finding is, it made more sense to basically let the city foreclose on them. They owed more in water and sewer and property taxes than they were able to get in rent. So the landlords basically said, screw it, I'm going to just let the city have the building. It's not worth it because I'm losing money every month, let alone I can't afford to carry this going forward. So a lot of times what these were is ultimately the city foreclosed on these properties. They didn't want to be a landlord, but by default, they became a landlord. And ultimately, what wound up happening was the city said, what if we were to fix these buildings, get it up to code, and then sell it back to the tenants? But in doing so, we'll create it as, with having, some real responsibility there, and we'll limit the the building to, a certain level of income restricted for those that are affordable or moderate incomes only. And ultimately, that was what created the HDFCs. Now, there was an intermediary step. There was this intern program, and not all the time did the buildings actually become HDFCs.
So just to be clear, an HDFC is still effectively owned by the co-op association, is effectively the city?
So originally that was the case, but then they sold them to the tenants. Now they created this company
So
called...
the tenants create their own co-op, and it gets the city, it's out of their hair.
Exactly. So what would wind up
it.
happening is they had this intern program where they would teach the tenants to be able to run their own buildings.
A little segue from the city to the tenants.
Right, exactly. So they created that kind of environment to make that happen. And ultimately, HDFC stands for Housing Development Funding Corporation. I've heard it also as Financing Corporation, but funding is, I believe, the correct one. And what these ultimately were is they sold off their shares, and this kind of throws off some bankers too, is that each apartment, no matter what the size, in many of the HDFCs, they were all 250 shares, sold at $1 per share. So many of these unit owners now bought their apartments that they were previously renting for $250 from the city. And the city made upgrades to the building, which included a lot of plumbing and structural and and new roofs and things. They didn't necessarily do it pretty. But that also kind of sets the tone because the city invested in proper infrastructure going forward. A lot of this happened in the 1980s. And during the 1980s, that was the first time that you started seeing people wanting to put in washers and dryers in apartments. So ironically, the upgrades that were made in these buildings to bring them up to code and looking forward into the future were actually able to in the future, add washer dryers into these apartments, which makes them even more desirable in many respects. Because you and I both know that if you're looking at market rate units, that laundry in the apartment could easily wind up adding six figures to the price of an apartment.
Sure.
Just the fact that you can add it, and the plumbing system is able to accommodate, it made these things quite valuable.
I, as a broker, I'll be honest with you, never understood the big deal about just taking your laundry down to the basement. I mean, isn't that your time to socialize with other people in your building?
I guess, but if you think about it, New Yorkers are so busy a lot of times, they might not be free at those hours.
Yeah.
So I'm spoiled to have a washer dryer in my unit, so it wasn't like a key criteria or anything. It just happened to be that's what way it worked out. But yeah, ultimately, that was a key perk, to it is that, like, if you're a busy New Yorker, you might not have a lot of free time. You might want to do your laundry at 1 a.m.
Sure.
So, that's just the practical reality. But yeah, going back to the apartments themselves, they were originally sold to tenants for $250. And even with that Columbia campus expansion, I don't know if they were $250, for the people they relocated to a brand new building on 148th, but I know that they were dirt cheap. So still, if it's what they did is they worked out an agreement. This was a property that was due to become an HDFC in that Columbia campus expansion zone. It never transitioned into it, and basically Columbia struck a deal with the city, said, listen, if we relocate these people not too far away, can we, have this lot, as part of our campus expansion? And they basically complied with the way that the HDFC program would run. So these people got themselves brand new apartments in a newly constructed building for very little. And in recent years, I've seen newly formed HDFCs sell. Now, granted, these are small apartments, but they were labeled as 3 bedrooms, and more appropriately, I think most people would probably use it as like a 1 bedroom plus 2 closets or something like that.
Sure.
But in any case, like $35,000 for what they were labeling as a 3 bedroom.
And you get to live in Manhattan.
To live in Manhattan, and granted, these were walk-up buildings, former tenements, but still, these have been refurbished, rehabbed, and ready to move in, for $35,000, and I think that was 2017, 2018, somewhere around there. So not too long ago, and I know that every once in a blue moon, you'll see some of these types of things come about. So they're still way, way, way below market. And that's also caused a problem too, because a lot of the unit owners that bought their apartments for next to nothing, well, they still kind of think of it as the monthly maintenance that they're paying to maintain the building and to pay the property taxes, to pay the oil man, to pay, the electricity bill. They're still thinking about it as rent. And that brings about like some of the problems that we come about is there's a problem in the building and it doesn't get fixed. It's up to them to fix it. And in many HDFC buildings, some of the owners now still think of themselves as tenants. And what they do is when a problem doesn't get fixed, they're calling 311 instead of figuring out how to address it within their building. They get fines and violations, and basically they're calling the law on themselves, and they get fined for it as a result. So that's some of the challenges that we come across with some of these HDFC buildings. And there are so many more. So, with a lot of HDFC buildings, a lot of people just don't recognize just how difficult some of these purchases can be and some of the challenges that we come across with these. So ultimately, there's about 1,100 of these HDFC buildings all throughout New York City. Some of them were luxury buildings, some were tenements. I'd say the majority of them do not have elevators. So when you do come across an HDFC that has an elevator in the building, these tend to be the larger units, the more desirable units, and these are the ones that create crazy bidding wars. They tend to go for much higher prices as well. So, that basically kind of sets that tone. Most are going to be pre-war. Most are going to be in Upper Manhattan. That's where the bulk of them are, but they can be found all over the city. I know that there's some in the Bronx. I know there's some in Queens, not many, but there's some in Brooklyn. There's some in other parts of Manhattan, too. So where you're going to find most of them in Manhattan, since this is more of a Manhattan-centric podcast, you'll tend to see them around Hell's Kitchen area. You'll tend to see them Lower East Side, downtown area. A few scattered in Chelsea, some scattered on the Upper West Side. Most of those on the Upper West Side, they're going to be more in like the 90s, low 100s, so closer to that more Upper Manhattan kind of feel. But you can find them scattered, throughout various neighborhoods. Upper East Side doesn't have too many, but I do recall seeing at least a couple of HDFC buildings. So when people look at these things, they are income restricted. We'll go over the income restrictions a little bit deeper, in a few minutes. But, another thing to note about a lot of these, and I go back to like the way that, some of the tenants, kind of still treat it as if they're renting. Another thing is the lower the price in HDFCs, a lot of times, and the numbers change, as prices get more expensive. But a lot of times if the price is too low, oftentimes I use that as an initial guideline. It's not a rule of thumb, but as a guideline, to say, I'm like, there's a good chance if it's below this certain threshold that this is more likely than not non-financeable. And the reason why it's non-financeable is more likely than not because the building management hasn't been managed quite properly. They don't have proper finances. They might not have proper finances. They might not have proper insurance. They might not be properly doing a lot of things. So a lot of violations, or sometimes they might even keep it up nice, but they might not necessarily be keeping up with the books properly. So a lot of times these are very informal, and it makes it very hard to get financed. So not to say that that the cheapest properties are all throwaways or difficult or whatnot, but obviously just keep in mind there's a good portion of them that are going to be cheap. Primarily because they must be all cash deals. Banks don't want to finance in them. So that is certainly a component of buying in these. And you need to also have, even if you have one that's well run and well managed, you need to have a bank or underwriter that's comfortable, that understands these. Like I said, they tend to all have 250 shares, not differentiating from one size apartment to another. So that trips up a lot of bankers when they go to underwrite. So a lot of times they can't necessarily underwrite because they don't understand these buildings well enough. We do have bankers that are comfortable in financing in HDFCs, so I wouldn't worry about that too much if you need some assistance, but just understand that there's a large portion of the banker community out there that won't underwrite in these. So you have to really know where to look in terms of financing. Just the general pre-approval is more likely than not going to get the deal done. So understand, that also a lot of these buildings, they're very fussy about who they want in, knowing that that these buildings are sometimes self-managed, and I know of a whole bunch of HDFCs that they wind up rejecting 70-80% of the buyers. So that's one of the tough things to really know, and there's buildings that are notorious out there, for that. So if you're working with a broker on it, it's really important that they understand the inventory. I can tell you if you're more looking in areas outside of Upper Manhattan, let's say you're looking on the Lower East Side or you're looking in Brooklyn, those boards just happen to say, you know what, these apartments, more likely than not, every building might be different, but they're more likely to say, you know what, the building is income restricted as long as you're within the income restrictions, no problem, and they treat it like it's a normal co-op. But in Upper Manhattan, I've seen more than a share of buildings that, that are quite fussy about who they're going to wind up approving. So, that's certainly something that's, worth keeping in mind. But, another thing over here that, makes it tricky buying an HDFC is apartment size. And, we're bouncing along fair housing laws in this case. And I'm sure you probably should be getting an attorney opinion on this, but it's been my experience that a lot of these buildings, if you're buying a larger apartment and you're single or you're maybe a couple, but you're buying a huge apartment, they might not want to approve you because of the size of the apartment. They might see it as there might be somebody, more fitting for that apartment size than you. So if you're like somebody single looking at a 3-bedroom, you might be looking at this and the board might not want to accept you because they might want to say, you know what, we want a couple with kids, that are looking at this 3-bedroom, because they need that space. They might not be otherwise able to afford it. So
they don't want to have a single person with 2 offices and a room for their dog.
Right, or make one of those bedrooms into an oversized, massive closet, for their Gucci and Fendi. And no offense to Gucci and Fendi or any of the other luxury brands, but that's not who they're often looking for. And that's something that's worth taking into consideration. And, is that housing discrimination? I don't know. That's something that you want to speak to your attorney about, before you, go into contract. So, another thing to keep in mind in buying HDFC is a lot of times because of the much lower price points, you're more likely than not to see unrenovated estate condition apartments in these buildings. A lot of times they need total gut renovation. And I've gotten buyers that are like, well, can't we negotiate on the price because this needs, a good $150,000 in renovation? And the what I can tell you based on working with these properties for so often is that's not usually going to be a factor. It's usually factored into the price already. So, a lot of times buyers are surprised. They're like, this is $450,000 and it needs a full gut renovation. And they're like, can't we negotiate significantly lower, because it's going to cost over $100,000 to renovate? Not necessarily, or usually likely. So, that's one of the challenges that you'll get in this world. So not only do you have to follow the income restrictions, sometimes buy in cash, and sometimes then you have to factor in cash for the renovation as well. So you do need to be really well funded.
You got to thread a lot of needles.
Yeah, exactly. And then we still haven't even gotten to the income restriction amounts yet. But typically what you're going to see in these HDFC buildings, they're usually pre-war, usually primarily, you'll see a lot of turn-of-the-century buildings. There are some condos that have fallen into these income-restricted worlds, and at the same time, they are falling into these categories where the income restricted, but it's a condo. So a lot of times it's not the same thing as the income restricted co-ops. At the end, when they go to resell, they'll lose that income restriction. I know we're tight on times, and we're not necessarily going to cover everything over here, that I've got in terms of the territory. But this is a starting point for a conversation. So if you want to understand HDFC better, we'll go into a lot of detail. But there's 2 other categories I want to talk before we cut off, for the day. There's the HDC category. Now HDCs, they're their own little world. They're more likely to be condops or condos. And, some of these and some of the buildings along 145th Street or that 145th Street area like Bradhurst and that, some of these buildings are really good examples. So they were built as income restricted. They have like a 15 or 25-year income restriction on them, but they also have a 15 or 25-year tax abatement tied to them. When that tax abatement runs out, ultimately that's when the income restriction will run out, and at the same time then they run more like condos. And there's no board approval in these. It's more like right of first refusal, like you'll see in condos. And some of these buildings are actually built, and they feel like condos. There's somebody attended lobby. So let's not call them door people because it's not that high level. But there is somebody always in the lobby to accept packages and things of that nature. Help walk dogs. I know they'll do that on the side. But there's an interior outdoor courtyard. That private to the residents of the building. There might be an office center, community room in these buildings. There might be a parking garage, separate fee, but in these buildings. So they feel much more like condos. But in that case, those that do have the income restriction, they have an income restriction very, very high. It's something like what they'll do is they'll say, even if you're single, but if you're up to a family of 4, it doesn't matter, you'll all fall in that same category of 4 income restriction level. So basically, you'll qualify for 250% of the New York area median income, and that changes on a regular basis annually. It's due to be updated sometime in the next 2 months or so. So we really should see updated numbers. But for up to a family of 4 in those buildings at 250% of the New York area median income, that could be something in the neighborhood of, I don't remember the exact numbers, but somewhere around, actually I have it right over here, $333,000 a year for income. So not exactly fully income restricted, but the majority of the buildings that you're going to see in the HDFC community are going to either be 120% of the area median income or 165% of the area median income. And the buildings are the ones to make these determinations as to what income restriction level they're going to use. Now, for somebody single at the 120% marker for early 2023, it should be updated soon, but right now that's about $112,000 a year. At the higher income restriction level for somebody single, it's $154,000 odd per year. If you're a family of 4 at the lower number, it's $160,000, and if you're at the higher income restriction level, it's $220,000 for a family of 4. So these numbers obviously update on an annual basis. We're coming due soon, but these are the kind of numbers that you need to be earning within, and basically there's a lot of things that the buildings will decide. So for instance, if the apartment needs if the apartment needs updating, these buildings have also what's known in the co-op world as a flip tax.
Yeah.
And the flip tax is a way for the co-op to kind of keep expenses low. When an apartment sells, typically, but not always, it's the seller that winds up paying it. In market rate buildings, it's typically 1% to 3%. In HDFCs, it's typically something more along the lines of 30%. And that goes to the affordable aspect of it. So 30% of your profits when you sell go back to the building. So that helps fund keeping those monthly charges really low. Oof. So there's a trade-off. I've seen one-bedrooms that have monthly maintenance, which includes the property taxes, for $300 a month. And that's as a result of the combination of flip taxes or retail spaces or something of those natures. But yeah, the flip taxes in HDFCs can be rather high. Now in those HDC versions, a lot of times that flip tax, after you pass that initial 15 or 25 year, it drops down to like none or like 1% or 3%. But it's more in the realm of normal co-op levels.
Sounds like an HDFC is a good option for somebody who's maybe not as wealthy as the average Manhattanite looking to buy a co-op or condo. But the caveat is you're not, just given that flip tax scenario you just described, you're not going to reap the same financial benefits long term as you would with a normal co-op or condo, just because of that flip tax and a number of other factors.
Right, exactly. And what we're seeing is a lot of the HDFC buyers, and this is where some of the irony comes in too. A lot of the HDFC buyers wind up buying these because they're getting gifts from family members. And not all of these HDFCs will allow substantial gifts. So that's where it gets really tricky buying into HDFCs, among all the other reasons that we discussed. So these things aren't exactly always very transparent or quick or easy, which is why, a good broker that is really familiar with these or being coached by one, because right now I've torn my hair out many times over, and that's why I've got this huge bald spot as a result of these buildings. So I'm now more inclined to coach other agents on how to work with HDFCs than being involved in the deals myself. But they can be a great product for the right kind of buyer.
Sure.
But number one, they have to have a substantial amount of cash, even though that they're much lower priced than a market rate unit. Typically, what I'll tell a lot of buyers that are thinking about these, I'm like, if you can afford a market rate apartment, buy the market rate apartment. HDFCs just can be heartbreaking. I've gone through client rejections in the past, or clients that that are just having such a tough time on the search.
I always sort of paraphrase the prototypical HDFC buyer as, your grandfather just died and left you a bunch of money, but you're making 65, 70 grand a year or whatever. So you're paying cash with grandpa's money, but you're just floating the maintenance with your modest salary.
Yeah, and some of the clients that I've sold have tended to be educators, so they're not making huge amounts of money. So maybe they'll fall in the income restriction, but they have money from other sources like an inheritance or something of that nature. Family gifting, inheritance, lotto winnings. Winning of lawsuits, but obviously we know that co-ops don't necessarily like buyers that are litigious, so that you got to be careful with. But yeah, these are some of the ways that you could potentially buy an HDFC, even though like a lot of times the income restriction does not align with the price. So a lot of times you need to have some other source of money in order to be able to afford to buy one of these.
Yeah.
So I know we've covered a lot of topic areas, and obviously there's a lot more that we could discuss on HDFCs. They aren't exactly the easiest product to buy for at least some of the reasons we discussed. There's even more out there that we can discuss if you wanted to, learn more about HDFCs. But for now, I think we'll use this as a good point to wrap. I want to thank you for joining us again at Harlem Stories, and we hope to hear back from you soon. Please provide feedback and subscribe, and we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everyone.